We're going to start talking about the blood vessels that are part of the cardiovascular system. What you see in front of you is actually a slide that has both an artery and a vein here. Are you able to identify which one's an artery and which is a vein at this point? Probably not, but they're pretty easy to identify, especially when we go through the next couple of slides. I'll tell you now that this is the artery. And one of the ways you can tell is you can see all this musculature here, a very thick layer of musculature in an artery compared to the little bit here in a vein. So when we look at an artery, we actually see that there are three different layers to the artery as well as in a vein. Before we get to that point, I want to remind you the definition of the lumen. What you see here is the lumen is the inside of that blood vessel, so where the blood is actually traveling through. That'll be called a lumen. That'll be a term that we use throughout the semester. So we'll talk about the lumen of a ureter, where urine is going to pass through. We're going to talk about the lumen of the digestive tract, where the food is going to be passing through. So learn that term lumen at this point. Now, there's three different layers or tunics. Now, tunics, and actually when we name these, we use the word tunica, right? So we're going to have a tunica intima. Tunica intima, it is intimate with the blood. This is a layer that is going to have an endothelial layer. Endothelial, we talk about that. It's a simple squamous layer of cells. Beyond that, it's going to have a connective tissue layer. You can see the connective tissue layer there as well. And notice that you have both these layers on both sides, right? You have connective tissue on either side. Now, the second layer we have here is the tunica media, right? Tunica media, the middle layer, this is also the muscular layer. And so when you look at the tunica media, you see a very thick layer of muscle. So you see how there's a thick layer of muscle over here in the artery, and that is a very thin layer in veins. So that's a major difference between arteries versus vein. It's seen here in the tunica media. As a matter of fact, that's the largest difference that we actually see is there in the tunica media. We also have, the final one is the tunica externa. And the tunica externa, it is external, it's the most superficial of the layers, it's the outermost layer of this blood vessel. We're again going to have some connective tissue, we're going to have some epithelial tissue, some simple squamous epithelial tissue in those layers. Okay, so what are the layers good for, right? There's a lot of different functions that are good for these different layers. We'll talk about some of the different functions with endothelial cells, right? The inside of a blood vessel. We'll talk about some of those different functions, besides being a smooth surface for blood to travel through. With the tunica media, we have a lot of musculature. So what do you think is going to happen there? Hopefully you said it's going to be vasodilation and vasoconstriction, right? Vasodilation and vasoconstriction. Remember, when muscle cells are around a vessel and they contract, you're going to have constriction, right? So we have these different layers, and again, I want you to notice that in both veins as well as arteries, we have all three of these different layers. They might be slightly different from each other, but they are definitely the same layers in all three. So all three of them have the same. We'll talk about capillaries in a bit, but capillaries, they actually only have two layers, or one real layer to them. It is going to be the tunica intima. And the tunica intima is really even a very thin layer there as well. So this is an endothelial layer with very little connective tissue. We'll talk about that a little bit later. When we look at arteries, we see that there are various types of arteries. And remember what arteries are, right? Arteries, do they have anything to do with the type of blood that is traveling through them? No, they have nothing to do with the blood that's traveling through them. They only have to do with the direction of the blood that's flowing away. So for example, you don't have oxygenated blood in arteries because all arteries don't have oxygenated blood. Remember this from last chapter, right? Arteries that are part of systemic circulation are going to carry blood away from the heart It's going to be fully oxygenated, bringing that oxygen out to the tissues. The pulmonary trunk, right, this guy right here, the pulmonary trunk, it is also an artery. But again, this time it's going to the lungs, so this is deoxygenated blood. It does not have a lot of oxygen in it, and therefore you cannot, again, both of these are arteries, you cannot say that it is because of the type of blood that is traveling through these blood vessels. Okay, so when you look at arteries, you look at there being three different types of arteries. The first type of artery is an elastic artery. An elastic artery has a lot of elastic fibers in it. Not a big surprise. You can actually kind of see some of this yellow making its way through here, indicating elastic fibers. Now this is a really important function because the heart, let's just pretend, here we go. The heart is going to pump blood, right? And so we have up here, we have a blood vessel, here's your artery, right? Now when it actually pumps blood, that blood vessel is going to stretch, right? It's going to fill with blood, it's going to be stretched. And this is a really important thing because that stretch, it's going to keep blood flowing during relaxation, during ventricular relaxation. So remember that our heart, it pumps systole, it relaxes diastole. It pumps systole, relaxes diastole. Does your blood squirt out and travel through your blood system and then stop during diastole and then move and then stop? No, it keeps going. And part of that is because we take this, let's try that again. We take this stretch that we saw with the elastic arteries and it recoils, pushing that blood through during diastole. So blood keeps flowing during diastole because of elastic arteries. So the aorta is a great example of an elastic artery. Okay? A muscular artery, our second type of artery here. So these are getting smaller as we get further away from the heart because there's a lot of branching, and so we're going to get to smaller and smaller arteries. Now muscular arteries, they have a really thick layer of muscle, and so that means they are very good at being able to dilate and constrict. Sometimes these are also called distributing arteries because these are the arteries that are going to regulate whether blood flows to an organ or away from an organ. So if you remember back when we were talking about the sympathetic nervous system, and when the sympathetic nervous system is active, it directs blood away from the gut, right? So the muscular artery is going to constrict, directing that blood away from or preventing more blood from flowing to the GI tract. But it's also going to dilate in the skeletal muscles because we want more blood to flow to the muscles so that we can run away from that bear or whatever, right? So that's the job of muscular arteries. Muscular arteries, they're distributing arteries. They make sure blood flows in the direction it's supposed to flow to. That's its job, okay? Now, there is also an arterial, right? And so an arterial, these are the smallest of the arteries. They're going to feed into capillary beds. So we're talking about feeding into capillary beds. So these guys here, that's what we're talking about. Feeding into this capillary bed, but they have a really important function. And their function is to regulate blood pressure, right? So they're going to cause dilation and constriction. And this time they're going to regulate blood flow, but they're really going to be involved in regulating your blood pressure, right? So when we talk about blood vessels dilating and constricting to regulate blood pressure, we're going to be focusing primarily on the arterioles and their ability to dilate and their ability to constrict. That's going to alter that function. Okay? So, when we take a look at these arteries again, taking a look at what they look at, this time we're going to look at them underneath a microscope. Again, you see this really thick layer of muscle, right? There's also elastic fibers that are traveling through here. Lots of elastic fibers. I think it's really hard to see on this micrograph, but there's elastic fibers that are traveling through there because this is an elastic artery, right? We get a little bit smaller, we still see a really nice thick layer of muscle, right? And again, we're going to have that musculature to be able to dilate and constrict. When we again move down to arterioles, that layer is a little bit thinner. There are still more smooth muscle cells there. They're going to be able to cause constriction and dilation to regulate blood pressure, right? So elastic arteries keep blood flowing during diastole. Muscular arteries are going to be distributed arteries, directing where blood should flow to. And arterioles, they're going to do a little bit of that distribution, just a little, but they're going to be major regulators of blood pressure.